Yeah, I had a great week, and it's been lovely to help lots of you, I think, think through some of these really big questions of life. And I don't know if any of you have watched the TV programme on a Monday evening on Channel 4 called Black Mirror. It's by Charlie Brooker. And the show, it was on around Christmas about a year ago, and then they've just started a new series. And the first one was on a couple of weeks ago called Be Right Back. I don't know if any of you saw it. And there's a very powerful and quite profound exploration of the issue of grief and the issue of human identity. There's a character called Martha and her boyfriend, lover, partner called Ash. And they're deeply in love. And then Ash leaves to go to work, and there's a car crash and he dies. Now, I've not spoiled that. That happens right at the start of the show. But then as the show progresses, you sense this deep, profound sense of loss that Martha feels. And a friend of hers points her to a new computer program that has been written. And it's quite a terrifying computer program. And often these Black Mirror shows are quite terrifying because they seem so close to reality. And this computer program is a new service that's been provided whereby you kind of log on and an instant messenger program pops up on your computer. And you type hello, and then a response came back, and she did it, typed hello, and a response came back from Ash. Hello, Martha. And Ash is the name of her late partner. And she says, are you there? And he says, yes, of course I'm here, it's me. And is she communicating with the dead? What's going on? And what the computer program does is it trawls through every email that's ever been sent, every Facebook update, every tweet that's been sent, and it kind of makes an artificial intelligence of the person who had passed away. And you can carry on to communicate with that person via this computer program. And you think, oh my goodness me, how terrifying, what's that like? Anyway, the show goes on, and there's an update that is developed whereby it's not simply a computer program and instant messenger, it's actually a voice. And it's scanned every phone call, every video update, every tweet. And she carries on this long conversation with this character who is actually a computer, or kind of someone she never meets, but enacting and trying to relive this life. And the story progresses and gets even worse. But it communicated to me a really profound sense in which we can't cope with grief in our society. And it may be that a computer can kind of make up a pretend version of the you that you lost, or the loved one that you lost. But we're much, much more than the sum total of the words we've said, our kind of vital statistics. We're a real person, and we really, really need them. And we really, really lose them when they go. 2,000 years ago, a group of friends were left devastated by the premature death of their friend. This was before the age of Twitter and Facebook and clever apps that could try to mimic their life. And yet 3 days later, they were absolutely convinced that he'd risen from the dead, and that he could therefore finally and fully defeat our greatest enemy, which is to say, death itself. And what we're going to do this evening, the crunch point really for thinking about Christianity, and this week has been put on by the Christian Union, is to think about Jesus Christ and his resurrection from the dead. That's the big claim, the unique claim really, of Christianity. And what we're going to be seeing this evening, I'm going to make two simple points, which each have got a few little sub-points. And the 2 points I want to make are that Jesus really rose, and therefore Jesus really matters. Jesus really rose, and therefore Jesus really matters. And Jesus really rose is my first point, and in order to explain that, we're going to hear a little Bible reading from these Uncover Gospels. They're all around the seats. Why don't you grab one of those and open it up, and Heather is going to bring us our little reading. She can introduce it to us. It's on the top of page 158. These little brown books, by the way, if you've not got one of them, do take it away. They're an eyewitness account of Jesus Christ, a reliable, proven source document that tells us the best we can know about Jesus. So Heather's going to read this for us. Thanks, Heather.
On the first day of the week, very early in the morning, the women took the spices they had prepared and went to the tomb. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they entered, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. While they were wondering about this, suddenly 2 men in clothes that gleamed like lightning stood beside them. In their fright, the women bowed down their faces to the ground. But the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, he has risen. Remember how he told you while he was still with you in Galilee. The Son of Man must be delivered over to the hands of sinners, be crucified, and on the third day be raised again." Then they remembered his words. When they came back from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and to all the others. It was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the others with them who told this to the apostles. But they did not believe the women because their words seemed to them like nonsense.
I'll read the last verse. Peter, however, got up and ran to the tomb. Bending over, he saw the strips of linen lying by themselves. And he went away, wondering to himself what had happened. Okay, we're going to see three key pieces of evidence. Here's our first point, that Jesus really rose. Okay, three key pieces of evidence. Firstly, the empty tomb. The empty tomb. Jesus clearly was dead in the previous chapter. There's no denying that. The Roman executioners in charge of dealing with his death themselves would have been killed if they had allowed someone to not die under their watch. They'd flogged his back till it looked like a jelly. They'd ram a spear into his side. They'd pierce his hands and feet, strung up in the hottest part of the day for 6 hours. He had surely died. You do not come down from a cross alive. And then he'd been buried and a 2-ton stone put in front. And people knew the name of the stone. Now, right at the top, if you've got that little passage open, you can look at the top. We see there's a guy called Joseph of Arimathea. And that's Luke's way of going on record to say, here's someone who took Jesus' body and buried it. This is not a kind of anonymous tomb somewhere hidden away that people have gone back to and lost. This is an on-record, data-certified tomb. It's all in the public domain. Jesus had died. He was buried. His burial is observed. People see him going in. And this massive stone is rolled in front. And then early the next morning, in Luke 24, it's empty. Now, it's very striking that the first people to see the empty tomb, and in fact the last people to see Jesus' dead body, do you know who they were? They were women. We're told women find him, or find the empty tomb in the verse 1 of 24. We find women had gone and saw where he was laid, the end of chapter 23. You think, well, so what? That's irrelevant, isn't it? Well, it's not irrelevant, because in the first century, this may seem horribly politically incorrect, but in the first century, a woman's testimony wasn't allowed even in a court of law. And so if you were Luke and you were trying to concoct a kind of a tradition that would become kind of believable, you would never make up that it was women who saw him die and saw him be buried and were the first to find this empty tomb. There's no way you'd make them up as your first witnesses, which for me makes me think, actually, I think there's a real degree of truth about what he said. It would be madness to write this if it weren't true. Anyway, the massive stone has gone, and so has the body. Sometimes people say, well, what about grave robbers? Well, if there had been grave robbers, why leave the strips of linen behind? We find Peter finds them on the top of page 160. The strips of linen, they would have been by far the most valuable, deeply impregnated with costly spices and ointments. They're the things you would rob. You wouldn't care about the body, you'd want the linen. And if it was the Romans who had taken hold of Jesus' body, why not just produce the body when all these claims are flying around and a kind of seeming insurrection is occurring as people are beginning to worship this risen Jesus Christ? So there's the first key piece of evidence. The tomb was empty. Second key piece of evidence, the resurrection appearances. Now, we don't have time to read this, but if you carry on reading, it's not just that the tomb is empty. If the tomb was empty, that's one thing, and maybe, his body's been taken away and there it is, they're hidden away. But you've got an empty tomb on the one hand and an appearing Jesus on the other hand. And he appears lots of times to lots of people. And many of those people would have been alive at the time when Luke wrote this eyewitness account. And as this gospel was written and being circulated, a mere 30 years after Jesus' death and resurrection, it would have been very, very easy for people to say, oh no, I didn't see him, stop saying I saw him. But no one did. No one kind of debunked the Gospels. They just became the common parlance. Everyone knew this was history. Another thing that you might say, people sometimes say, well, surely seeing the risen Jesus, maybe it's just a mystical apparition. You want to see a risen Jesus, and so you see him anyway. Well, no, I don't think that's the case either, because he touched stuff. It wasn't just a kind of a ghost, and he deliberately ate food. He drank drink. It really was the same Jesus who had died on Good Friday is appearing on Easter Day, and he's not a ghost, he's the real thing. And you say, well, surely maybe someone thinks it's the real one. Well, no, not hundreds and hundreds at the same time having the same hallucination. I don't think so. He wasn't resuscitated. He wasn't reincarnated. He wasn't just raised in the hearts of his followers, which is what some more liberal people want to try and say. You know, he really had raised physically from the dead. The empty tomb, the resurrection appearances, and the third key piece of evidence is the evidence of history itself. Often I hear it argued that, well, of course, back in those days, in the first century, everyone believed in resurrections. They're just kind of gullible, weren't they? We're much more scientific. We know people don't rise from the dead. Back then, everyone was doing it. Well, they weren't rising from the dead back then either, I'm afraid to break it to you. We've got to be a bit careful. There was this professor in Oxford called C.S. Lewis who wrote the Narnia books. You may have heard of him. And he says that we need to be careful whenever we look back on things a long time ago, that we don't have chronological snobbery. When we're kind of like, yeah, of course, those poor ancient people who just believe the most stupid things. Actually, they didn't believe in resurrection at all. No way. There were two very big socio-religious currents swirling around at the time of Jesus. And those were Judaism, the kind of religion of the Jews, and Greco-Roman paganism. They're the two currents swirling around. And Judaism believes there is such a thing as a resurrection, but it only happens on the last day, when God raises from the dead all people and he judges them. Some go to heaven and some are punished. And that's the resurrection the Jews believe in. Well, the Greco-Roman paganism, they believe that the body, the physical body, is a bad thing. That goes into the ground when it dies, and the spirit is released and goes up into the kind of other, the one, the forms of Plato, and it's released to go away. And they would have laughed at the idea of the bodily resurrection of an individual in history. And yet people believed it. They believed it in their thousands. People like disciples who had once been cowards and afraid and denied Jesus, they turned into courageous warriors for Jesus, defenders of the Christian faith, and most of them died for it. Now, of course, we could say, well, there are martyrs for people today, people who die for things that are different from that, but you die for something that you never die for something that you know to be false. They were absolutely convinced that Jesus rose. And the result is the spread of Christianity, almost an explosive spread. Unlike most other religions which have thrived in a position of power, where their leaders have been in a kind of a position to influence very greatly, it was Christianity in the early days was the vast underdog. It was the one that everyone was trying to squash and push out. Nero hated the Christians, tried to stamp it all out, blamed them for the Great Fire of Rome, and yet it spread and spread and spread. Here's Lord Darling, the former Lord Chief Justice, writing, "In its favour as a living truth, there exists such overwhelming evidence, positive and negative, factual and circumstantial, that no intelligent jury in the world could fail to bring in a verdict that the resurrection story is true." No one would fail to bring that in. Everyone would say, of course it's true. Jesus really rose. That's my first point. Secondly, a little bit more brief, which means point 2, Jesus really matters. If Jesus really rose, then Jesus really matters. So what? He rose from the dead. There we are, at the end. Well, no, I think there's maybe 3 or 4 amazing implications that we need to kind of quickly dig into very briefly. First big implication, it proves Jesus is God. He's a man of great power, he's a man of great compassion, yet he claimed to be God on earth. And he fulfilled loads and loads of prophecies that he could never have rigged, and many of those were about his resurrection. And that's the kind of key truth. Without the resurrection from the dead, Jesus' outlandish claims to being God, to being the world's only saviour, the world's true king, it would all be bravado. If he'd have stayed dead, well, that would have been that. But having risen from the dead, it's kind of the ultimate trump card is played, and forevermore, Jesus has got to be reckoned with as the God that he claimed to be. He said, I'm going to die and rise because I'm God, and he died and rose, and therefore he's God. That's the first big claim, or the first big implication. It shows that Jesus is God, which secondly shows that Jesus can be trusted. What makes a person trust someone? I guess if you make an outrageous promise and then demonstrably keep it, something that was so outrageous, and then you keep it, well, it was such an unlikely thing to have kept that, then surely you trust them for everything else. I'm just trying to think of an example. Imagine I was to get home tonight, it's whatever, 9:30, 10, maybe it's 10:30, I get in and see my wife, Sally, and she needs the shopping done. And I'm absolutely exhausted, and she needs an enormous, great big shop by first thing tomorrow morning. And I say that I'll drive to Tesco, and it's at, whatever, 10:30 at night, and I'll drive there. I'm exhausted, but I'll drive and I'll get all the shopping she needs and put it all away, and I do it all through my exhaustion. And say then I've done that, and that is a really, really hard thing for me to do. Well, if I can deliver on such a hard thing, well, I can be trusted to go down to the end of the road to buy her a newspaper if she asks. I can be trusted on an easy thing if I've delivered on an impossible thing. Oh, I'm dropping some paper here. If I've delivered on an impossible thing, I can deliver on an easy thing too. Well, Jesus delivered on something seemingly impossible. Surely we can trust him for everything else. And he spoke about life, and he spoke about death, and he spoke about salvation. He spoke about heaven and hell and what life's about. Which brings me to my third wonderful implication. If he really rose and he really matters, then he really can offer salvation. He really can offer us life. Tonight we're talking about imagine life. As Jesus died on that cross, many people would have thought, well, that's the end of the story. He's lost. Now, what kind of salvation can Jesus really offer? You know, he says he's going to give me life, but then he's going to lose his life, and then he's dead, and there it was. Oh, I trusted in the wrong person. In 1815, Britain was at war with France. It wasn't the Six Nations back then, but it was the Napoleonic Wars. And it was between Wellington and Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo. And in 1815, the news, in Britain, they were on tenterhooks waiting to see what would happen over there in France. And people were waiting on the edge of their seats, as it were. There was a sailing ship which semaphored the result of the key battle back to Britain. And there was a signal post on the top of a Winchester cathedral that could see the semaphore among the flags. And it was giving them the information through across the flags, and the news broke, Wellington defeated. And then the fog descended, and the whole country went into mourning for several hours. We've been defeated, we've lost the battle, we're broken. And then the fog lifted. And the semaphore message was continuing. Wellington defeated the enemy. And actually what looked like a defeat was a mighty victory. And of course, Napoleon was defeated at the Battle of Waterloo. When Jesus died on the cross, it looked like he had lost. He had been defeated. He was gone. It was over. But having defeated death, having died our death in our place, he's gone through that door of death, but he then come out the other side and he says, look, you can trust me with your death now. You can trust me that if you trust in me, if you put your hand in my hand, I'll take you through whatever life throws at you. Ultimately, I'll take you through death into a new kind of life, the other side, a life beyond the grave. And do you know what's so amazing about this life that I'll bring with you? Is that it kind of backtracks into this life now. The moment you put your hand in Jesus' hand and say, I'm going to stick with you, I'm going to trust in you, he says, I'll be with you. I'll forgive you for everything that you've ever done wrong. My death has paid for that all. You'll never be cast out again from my presence. I'll accept you as my friend. Jesus is risen from the dead, meaning that he's fully and finally finished with our wrongdoing, our death, our sin. He can offer us life. He really matters because he's God, he can be trusted, he offers us life. But fourthly, and very briefly and lastly, I need to say, Jesus' resurrection proves that Jesus will rule forever. And this is a very key last little point. I want you to turn to page 150. And this is the last thing I'll say, and then you can have some pudding pretty soon, so look out for that. But here you go, let me just read out these little verses. This is Jesus before Pilate, before he dies on the cross, and he's before Pilate. Let me read you, this is little number 66 on page 150. At daybreak, the council of the elders of the people, both the chief priests and the teachers of the law, met together, and Jesus was led before them. If you are the Messiah, they said, tell us. Jesus answered, I tell you, you will not believe me. And if I asked you, you would not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the mighty God. Jesus just kind of walked away from, and whose offer of life we've spurned. And we need to realise that ignoring him now does not mean he'll ignore us forever. So I just want to ask you, what will you do with this resurrected Christ? What will you do with Jesus? Because I think the evidence is pretty clear. Jesus really rose, which means Jesus really matters. So what are you going to do with him?